Children born of a fairy man and a mortal mother are said to grow up strong and powerful, but with evil and dangerous natures. This could explain what we might consider to be cruel and twisted behaviour of some of the fairies I'll show you today. But I say what we might consider because remember, fairy folk don't live with these same societal rules, values, or even spiritual guidance as we do. G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. Now, fairies do their own thing, and I respect them for that. But if we somehow intrude upon fairy, if we anger or offend them, we might feel that their response or their retaliation is violent or an overreaction, but that doesn't make it wrong. It's just different to our human customs. I'm hoping that this collection of true sightings and encounters might serve as a reminder of the contrasts, of how important it is to respect the ways of the fairy folk and never to expect them or even hope that one day they will fall into line with us, because that will never happen. Some years ago, a woman living in Kerry declared that she had been overlooked by the evil eye. She had no pleasure in her life and no comfort, and she wasted away because of the fear that was on her, caused by the following singular circumstance. Every time that she happened to leave home alone, and that no one else was within call, she was met by a strange-looking woman, totally unknown to her, who, fixing her eyes on her in silence and with a terrible expression, cast her to the ground and proceeded to beat and pinch her till she was nearly senseless, after which her tormentor disappeared. Having experienced this treatment several times, the poor woman finally abstained altogether from leaving the house, unless she was protected by a servant or a companion. And this precaution she observed for several years, during which time she never was molested. So, at last, she began to believe that the spell was broken and that her strange enemy had departed forever. In consequence, she grew less careful about the usual precaution and one day stepped down alone to a little stream that ran by the house for to wash some clothes. Stooping down over her work, she never thought of any danger and began to sing as she used to do in the light-hearted days before the spell was upon her, when suddenly a dark shadow fell across the water, and looking up, she beheld to her horror the strange woman on the opposite side of the little stream, with her terrible eyes intently fixed on her, as hard and still as if she were of stone. Springing up with a scream of terror, she flung down her work and ran towards the house. But soon she heard footsteps behind her, and in an instant she was seized, thrown down to the ground, and her tormentor began to beat her even worse than before, till finally she lost all consciousness. And in this state she was found by her husband, lying on her face and speechless. She was at once carried to the house, and all the care that affection and rural skill could bestow were lavished on her, but in vain. She, however, regained sufficient consciousness to tell them of the terrible encounter she had gone through, but died before the night had passed away. A man was visiting a house nearby here. It was a very dark night, and when it came near 12 o'clock midnight, the man started for home. The people of the house told him not to go at that time, that it was a bad time of the night to be out, but the man said that he had to go. So he started off, but when he was going along, he noticed that all the place was changed. Everything looked different. He kept walking along, but after a while, he saw that he was right in the middle of a group of fairies. The fairies were very cross when they saw the man in the middle of their party. Then the fairies got a rope and tied it round the man. They then dragged him across the ground for he doesn't know how long, but when the rooster cried, they let the man off, and all the fairies disappeared. It is said that when the rooster crows, the fairies do disappear. Long ago, there was a boy in Rathana named Ryan. There was a rath in the field near his house. The Doyles now live in that house. Anyhow, there were trees growing in the rath, and the boy went to the rath and cut a branch. He came home roaring with the branch still in his hand and said that a little man came out of the rath and struck him in the knee with something. There was a man in Enniscorthy known to be wise to the way of the fairies, and the boy's father went to him on horseback and told him the story of what had happened. This fairy man gave him 2 bottles of water to give the boy and told him to mind them carefully when he was coming across the Skolog Bridge. The man said he would, and when he came to the bridge, he was holding the bottles tightly in his hand. Just as he came upon the bridge, a fairy man came out of the bridge and threw him off the horse, breaking both bottles. So the father went back to the fairy man and told him what happened. So the fairy man, or fairy doctor, came home with him and looked at the boy's knee. He seemed to pull something that looked like a knitting needle from the knee. And then he told them to sow a birch tree over the spot where the boy had cut the branch. And if he didn't do this, the boy would get bad again. So the father sowed the birch tree, and the boy, he got all right. There are certain days on which it is not right to speak of the fairies. These days are Wednesdays and Fridays, for then they are present, though invisible, and can hear everything, and lay their plans as to what they will carry off. On Friday especially, their power for evil is very strong, and misfortunes are dreaded in the household. Therefore, on that day, the children and cattle are strictly watched. A lighted wisp of straw is turned round the baby's head, and a quenched coal is set under the cradle and under the churn. And if the horses are restive in the stable, then the people know the fairies are riding on their backs. So they spit 3 times at the animal, and the fairies scamper off. This cure by the saliva is the most ancient of all superstitions, and the islanders still have the greatest faith in its mysterious power and efficiency. In the South Island, as night was coming on, a man was giving his cow water at a well, and as he looked on the other side of a wall, he saw many strange people playing hurley. When they noticed him looking at them, one came up and struck the cow a hard blow, and turning on the man, cut his face and body very badly. The man might not have been so badly off, but he returned to the well after the first encounter and got 5 times as bad a beating. And when he reached home, he couldn't speak at all until the rooster cried. Then he told about his adventures to his family and slept a little. When he woke up in the daylight, he was none the worse for his beating. It was believed that the fairies had rubbed something on his face. Patrick himself knew this man, who, if still alive, is now in America, where he went several years ago. We live in a place called Isle. Fairy people lived there before us, and there is a story told about them. One Monday morning, a strange man came into this house, and said he to the woman, "Where is the man of the house?" The woman said, "He is there in the yard with another man." The strange man went outside and asked the man of the house for a bite to eat. The man of the house said it was a bad time to come, as there was nothing in the house ready to be eaten. So the stranger turned and left, and the husband came into the house. The wife, on finding out what the strange man had wanted, knew at once what she must do. She quickly gathered up some food and set out to look for him, but he was gone. Only days later, the man of the house fell suddenly sick and died. One night, 2 men were going by the rowan tree at Silver Stream when they heard something growling. One went over to the rowan tree, and a voice said, "Grrr, grrr." So the man went closer. Now there was a stream at the other side of this rowan tree, but the man didn't know this. The fairy crossed to the other side of the stream, and the man ran after it. He fell into the deep stream, and he could hear something saying, "Take that, take that." Well, he managed to save himself from getting drowned, and he thought the voice must belong to a fairy, but he said nothing. The fairy said, "Speak," and the man said, "Why?" and grabbed hold of it. It cried, "Don't drown me!" And the man got so scared that he dropped the fairy into the stream, and it drowned right there before him. That man died. He dropped to the ground dead before he even reached his home, because it was believed there was bad luck in killing that fairy. One day in Morgaro, a man was digging in his field. There were 2 fairy bushes in the field, and they had long been left there, as no one would cut them down because they said the fairies would bring them bad luck if they did. But one day this man went down to the garden and dug the 2 of them up. Then he threw them aside and filled the holes again with clay. Some of the clay went into his eyes and he went blind, and in a fearful state couldn't get back to his house. An hour passed and no one came, till at last he heard the galloping of a horse and he shouted for help. And next he found a neighbour at his side, so he told the neighbour what had happened. The neighbour kindly took the man back to his home, and just as they were going through the door, they heard his wife screaming in pain. A kettle of boiling water had fallen on her leg, and she could not walk for the pain. The neighbour that led the blind man to the house ran to the nearest house for help. They bandaged up the woman's leg, and she was able to walk at a limp with a stick to help. The next morning, as she was going to get their breakfast, a little woman with beautiful curly hair and a little green jacket came to the kitchen door and said to the wife, "If someone will lead your husband down to the garden and set the 2 trees that he dug up, she would release him from his trouble." So the woman went and told her husband what the stranger at the door had said. When they returned to the kitchen, the little woman had gone. So she got 2 men and told them to take her husband down to the garden and set the trees in the same place they had been. And just when he had his work finished, his sight returned. There was a house at Lisrobin Cross long ago, and one day the woman of this house went out picking a bundle of firewood. It was deep into winter, so she was very surprised to see a bird out, a strange bird that, she said, resembled a duck. When she came home carrying the firewood under her arm, she suddenly got sick and was very, very bad. The husband went at once for the doctor, and while he was gone, a little man wearing red came in and asked the neighbour, who was minding the woman, if the woman of the house was sick. She said she was. Then he went to the top of the table and started reading or reciting words. The baffled neighbour looked at the sick woman, then back again, and saw that the little man was gone. When the husband came home, the woman of the house was all right again. It is thought that the creature she had seen was a fairy. He got sorry for injuring her and came back to make her all right. There was once a rich woman living beside a fort in this region who had 6 children. One day an old hag came up to the house and knocked at the door. The woman of the house went out and said, "I can't help you." Then the poor woman said, "Can you give me a dish of meal, as my children are dying with fever?" And the woman of the house turned away to close the door. The poor woman said, "You'll have bad news next day." And so it was. The next day, 2 of the woman's little boys were playing beside a river when one fell in, and the other fell in after him, trying to save him. Both were drowned. One night, a man walked up a hill where he could hear music and dancing. He went up to the top of the hill, and from there he saw a crowd of fairies coming toward him. To his horror, he saw that the fairies were carrying a coffin. They came right up to the man and made him carry the coffin. They made him carry it for miles and miles. When he had carried it a long journey, he collapsed on the ground. That man died the next day. Fairy forts were honoured and respected in years gone by. Our village, although it is so unimportant, can at least boast of having a fairy fort, which consists of a sort of plateau with a trench of water all around it. Large oak trees with strong, long brown boughs grow in it. The Irish name of the village is Listaric, or the Fort of the Oaks. Old people here firmly maintain that the forts are the meeting places of the fairies. More so even when a young boy found the smallest little pipe imaginable beside a tree in the fort. People say it was surely a fairy pipe. The funny thing about the fort is that from one of them, a person can see another fort right over the country. A man who lived in New Bliss went out to this fort beside his home one evening when he was young for to herd cows. As the night drew near, the boy, whose name was Patrick Screenan, fell asleep on the side of this fort. He was so tired that he did not waken until after midnight, and then he found that he could not walk as his leg was crippled. His mother maintained that it was the work and the revenge of the Sidhe. Never after that could the poor man walk, and often in his lifetime he heartily wished that he had never interfered with the fairies' fort. Now, I'm no fool. You heard what I said earlier about Friday and Wednesdays being the worst days to annoy or offend the fairy folk. And here I am releasing this video on a Friday. So let me say that in no way am I casting judgment on fairy behaviour. What I'm hoping to do is to show you how differently fairy folk interpret and react to situations. And what's more, recommend patience and acceptance on our part. Once again, we find the best defence when it comes to fairies is to respect them, respect their places, and wherever possible, leave them alone. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe and tickle that little thumbs up button. And don't forget to click the notifications bell. These little things mean so much to channels like me. I'd like to send big love and thanks to my patrons and members for your support. It means the world to me. Until next time, stay curious. Cheerio.